Well, thank you everyone for being here this afternoon and for joining us for a lecture on what I think is fair to say, a very timely and important topic. We're very pleased to have with us today Dr. Rouzbeh Parsi from the European Union Institute of Security Studies in Paris. And just by way of giving you a bit of background, Dr. Parsi's areas of expertise are Iran, Iraq, and the Gulf states. And his research interests include governance and political culture issues in Iran and Iraq, as well as wider regional affairs. And at EU-ISS, Dr. Rouzbeh has published on Iran's nuclear program, domestic politics, and foreign policy. And he recently produced a very interesting edited volume looking at the internal political and social developments in Iran since the 1979 revolution. So again, we're very pleased to have you with us today, and why don't you just take it away?
Thank you. First of all, thank you to Shannon and the SIPRI team for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here, and I hope I will be able to engage you in a discussion about what's going on in Iran and the relationship with the rest of the world, particularly when it comes to the nuclear issue. First of all, I also have to say, considering what we're going to discuss, that I work for the European Union, but I do not represent the European Union. I work at an institute that has intellectual independence, so my job is not to toe any particular party line or official diplomatic line, for that matter. Now, let me begin with some background to where we are now. As you probably all know, Iran had very divisive presidential elections in 2009, and basically what we've had since then is the opening up of many of the structural problems and fissures that you have in Iran since the revolution in 1979. So we have to remember that while some of these things are things happening on the surface, underlying many of them are some structural deficiencies that would come out and do repeatedly on a regular interval, if you will, come out and show themselves. Now, what the elections in 2009 opened up for and gave us a kind of quick insight into is the kind of divisions that exist within the political elite, on the one hand, but also the sociological developments of society at large. Basically, you can say that you could, if you want to be a bit extreme, remove the person of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad from the equation, and you would still end up with some of the problems that you have today. Not just because they precede him as a person, but because he's also representative, if you will, of the next generation within the political elite. The ones who did live through the revolution, but were not guiding partners of it, but fought in the war instead with Iraq, and that is their formative experience. So this is the next generation now coming to the fore and trying to grab their piece of the cake, as so to say, and they are not coherent necessarily in terms of their ideological outlook, but they do have ambitions. And that is one of the things that we can see now in the last couple of years, how there is this tension between the old guard who steered the country through the revolution and for the last 30 years more or less, and the new ones who want to come to power and who are not necessarily then of one ideological bent, but nonetheless have ambitions. The elections in 2009 were also divisive, of course, because they showed not only the tensions, but also the limits for how far this system allows its own internal breed of reformists to go in terms of what can be done to change the country. In a sense, it is coming to the fore of a very important principal and structural problem that goes back to 1979 itself. That is, what was the ideals of the revolution? How can you actually fulfill them? And what is the diagnosis of the fact that we haven't been able to fulfill them even now 30 years later? And here is, if you will, where the inherent contradictions of a system that both tries to marry a religious theological hierarchy and a republican tradition with people's participation comes to its logical, if not end, but to one of those regular showdowns of which side gets to run the ship. So even if, on the one hand, you could say that the elections in 2009 was a decision giving all power, all levers of power within the system to the conservatives. At the same time, it also showed that the system itself, its own strength, was built on the fact that it had both. It had both a reformist wing and a more conservative wing. And what happened was that the reformist wing was basically marginalized and put out. So, in the most immediate sense, you could say this was a conservative victory. Having now control both of the office of the supreme leader, the parliament, since before the presidential elections already, and then finally with the president himself. But what his first win in 2005 already showed, and what the 2009 victory, which can be debated whether it was real or not, does tell us is that what all these conservatives, these so-called principalists, have in common in the political debate in Iran is that they didn't like the reformists. So what we get is the kind of, well, shall we really use that kind of analogy? Perhaps we could. We talk about half-time when it comes to radioactive material. And in that sense, you can see this is the equivalent of the half-time when it comes to Iranian political elite. This is the Iranian version of the babushka model, because inside each doll is another little doll. What the conservatives had in common was their dislike of the reformists. What the conservatives had in common once the reformists were put out of the game was their dislike for the president, who also happened to be a conservative. So on the one hand, it shows us that these political labels in themselves don't always necessarily tell us that much about how the political game is played. It tells us that there are more fractions in this game than just a question of reformists and conservatives. But it also tells us that the core definitional point of who is a conservative doesn't really mean that much, because it's always done in opposition to something else. It's a very banal, if you will, observation, but nonetheless quite important, because it shows and gives us some explanation for the fact that since 2009, with all the power at the disposal of the supreme leader, parliament, and the president, some of the most important structural problems in Iran have not been solved. On the contrary, to some degree, they have worsened. And we're not talking about this purely from a domestic point of view. To that, we then have to add the sanctions, etc., which I will get back to in a moment. So President Ahmadinejad had at his disposal, if you will, the golden opportunity to do something about some of these structural flaws in the Iranian system, particularly when it comes to the economy, which is the biggest headache and it's been there basically since the war. Now, these structural flaws are no secret. Everyone knows what they are. In Iran, everyone knows what they are. And they also know more or less what has to be done about it. But just like trying to do health reform in the US, it's not just enough to know what the problem is. It's a question of finding the political alliances that can make the solution stick and survive all the problems that comes with this kind of reform and all the complaints that come with it. And this was, of course, the opportunity to do it, because he had the backing of parliament, more or less, and the oil price is high, so you have the financial means to go through with it. And that is basically the economic reforms of subsidies. Now, the subsidy reform, which is an unending migraine in Iran, also in this phase of so-called solutions, it has yet to end. In fact, we're now basically slowly going into the second phase of the reforms on the subsidies. But the interesting thing, of course, is to see how you can botch something so monumentally that from the outset looked as the golden opportunity. And in itself, it becomes a very good depiction of President Ahmadinejad's way of doing politics, which will then also spill into how the nuclear issue is handled as a domestic game. Basically, everyone knows the problem. You can make certain kinds of suggestions that in the long run will change things, that will bring a lot of money back to the state, and will at the same time make prices more realistic in the country for certain things, including fuel. Because if you don't do this, the trajectory is basically that the whole state budget at some point will be spent on subsidizing fuel and certain staple goods and food, which is an impossibility. So at some point, you have to put a stop to this, and you have to reform the way these things are given to people that don't have the financial means to survive on their own. Now, what happens is basically that, first of all, analytical institutions that are supposed to help just tell you the most basic economic facts of what the budget looks like, what things cost, and what the projected costs would be. Having done that, the economic game becomes a purely political domestic game of throwing numbers at each other. So you end up with a system where some parliamentarians in opposition, no matter how conservative they are, in opposition to the president and his administration, have one set of numbers of what the subsidies cost, what the reform will bring in, and what the reformed subsidies will cost. The president has its own, his economy minister has his own, and all three of them go to the news outlets trying to spin it their own way. Now, first of all, the way it was done with cash handouts means that you increase inflation because you're putting a lot of cash into the system without a concomitant increase in production. At the same time, they don't agree on what the criteria level is of poverty, which means you can't really tell how many people are supposed to get the cash handout, which is the compensation for the reformed subsidies. So since you don't know what the input data is, and you don't know how the equation works, your output data is pure political speculation. Now, besides the fact that the fallout of this, the repercussions of it, have not yet all been seen, of course, what it does mean is that confidence in the system being able to report more or less accurately what is going on to itself in its decision-making process is lost. And you end up with wildly different ways of understanding and projecting where the economy is going. This, of course, without actually being able to achieve the original goal of the subsidies reform, because at this point, very few people know, if anyone, with hard facts, how much money was saved by removing the subsidies and how much was then returned to the people through cash handouts. But we do know some of the effects, like increased inflation and the lack of trust. Now, this is not to say that the structural need for this reform or that these subsidy reforms are now lost inevitably, but it does tell you something about the modus operandi of how this works. Not very well, to put it mildly. President Ahmadinejad today is a lame duck. The reason for this is not just how he handled the subsidy reforms, but primarily because he did the one thing that no president is expected to do, and particularly not one that's conservative, and who, to a large degree, not only owes his re-election to the ballot, somewhat mysterious and, if you will, nebulous in its contours, but to the supreme leader and his vouching for the elections and backing up of the president following the debacle of the elections. So what happens is that President Ahmadinejad far too many times decides to challenge implicit or explicit orders from the supreme leader on certain issues. The most important red line being deciding who is going to be the Minister of Intelligence. At this point, you can say that it all comes together in a perfect storm. All the different conservative factions of parliament who are not immediately connected to Ahmadinejad and who have been alienated through the last couple of years because they're all expected to support him, but they very seldom get something in return from him, either in ideological terms or in more practical terms, then turn on him in this issue and, of course, close rank with the supreme leader. And from that point on, the position of this particular president is continuously weakened, to the point today, of course, that the supreme leader is asking the new parliament, recently elected, to not bother the administration too much and let them get some work done. And in between, we can see this waning influence of the president on the nuclear issue. Sometimes we have to remind ourselves that the Iranian president actually has no influence, or is not supposed to institutionally have an influence on the nuclear dossier. It's not in his brief. The reason why this particular president managed to influence the nuclear brief to such an extent is because of his ability to play the media. And this is something that has come back to haunt himself, because you have to remember, in the beginning, when he was president, Ali Larijani, the present and newly re-elected Speaker of Parliament, was the Iranian negotiator in the nuclear field. What Ahmadinejad did as a newly elected president was, of course, to go out in media and have all kinds of positions on the nuclear issue, effectively undermining the ability of Larijani, when he reached Geneva, to present a coherent Iranian position. Now, this is, of course, is no excuse for whatever that position of Iran was, but it's indicative of how the domestic game influences the way they kind of reach a decision on the nuclear issue. So this becomes a political football where Ahmadinejad manages, in a way, through all outrageous demands and discussions on questions that are not related to this, to give the impression that he has a lot of influence on the nuclear issue. And in the end, that means that he does have some influence, but it is not institutional. It's by power of what he can do, and more importantly, what he can screw up. This comes back to haunt him when he needs to score a political victory and start signaling that he is interested in a deal on the nuclear issue. At that point, you see all other conservative factions, including a certain Mr. Larijani, becoming very hardcore and hardline on the nuclear issue for exactly the same reasons. So to put it in very simplistic terms, more or less everyone with some kind of realistic political experience in Iran understand the contours of a nuclear deal. And they also more or less know what they have to give and what they ought to expect. But like all politicians, they want to clinch the deal and come home with a victory. They don't want to be seen trying. And that's the gap between trying and therefore exposing yourself to your political competitors and actually having the deal in your hand and being able to go home and gain and claim credit for it. And that's where each party here in the domestic game in Iran has played each other out. They all want to come home with a victory, but as soon as they're seen trying, they're opening themselves up for criticism from someone else who is willing to do exactly the same deal, but of course want to be the one doing it. The positive, if you will, the way to look somewhat optimistically at how this is developing at the moment is that with the latest developments in Iran, the parliamentary elections and the fact that the nuclear issue went dormant for some time, is that now, more official than ever before, the line between the negotiator, the team of Iranian negotiators, and the supreme leader is very, very clear. I think that is one of the most important signals that we've gotten in the last 6 months, is that we're now not talking about someone who has to go home and report to the president first or someone else or play that game. This goes directly to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. Now, that does not mean that you don't have to sell a deal when you come home. You still need to get all these different factions to sign it and help you make it sail through. But it does mean that in terms of decision making, the process is at least a bit more transparent and simple than it used to be. And that is useful and hopeful, because then it means that when they finally hopefully reach some kind of deal, the ability of being able to sell it when you go back to Tehran is much, much higher and stronger. Now, so now we kind of slided into the nuclear issue. As you all know, probably, there is a rather tortured history behind all these negotiations that go back a number of years now. And in that sense, they're just a prolongation of other kinds of tortured negotiations between Iran and primarily the West. We have had negotiations stop and go. We've had a period that seemed to actually reach results, and that was when we had a freeze for freeze. Basically, there was a common understanding of what should not be provoked, and that could buy time to slowly solve the substantial issues. The problem with that kind of understanding, of course, is that when it is disappointed, the backlash is stronger. And I think the freeze for freeze is quite important because it tells us something about, we have to remember how the Iranian side interprets this, and in their interpretation, they gave up something they wanted to learn how to master. They put it on hold for the EU then to come. As I said, Ahmadinejad today is very much of a lame duck, both when it comes to domestic politics, but also when it comes to foreign policy, especially when it comes to the nuclear issue. This is now much more a dossier directly linked to the supreme leader. This has also meant, to some degree, a return to a calmer attitude, if you will, a much more professional tone in the way things are done. It doesn't mean that if you were to interview EU or US negotiators tomorrow, they would tell you that they're happy with the way the Iranians are negotiating. But at least now the noise level of distraction has lessened. And I think that is helpful. That in itself, obviously, is not enough for a deal to be reached, but it's a beginning. Now, as you know, recently there was the second round in Baghdad of negotiations that were prolonged, partly because of a sandstorm. I suppose we should be happy for that, but partly because the gap, the expectation gap and the gap between the negotiating positions were much larger than expected. Supposedly, it was surprising, and therefore there was need to continue the talks in order to at least reach the point where there was hope to continue talking next time in Moscow. Before I get into the nitty-gritty of that, I know I'm kind of running over time, but I think one of the things I want to point at here that is very important is that as far as I can see, there are some structural policy problems here. Just like we can talk about structural flaws in the Iranian system that come back at a regular interval, we have in the nuclear dossier some very important structural problems that I think people are ignoring or trying their best to ignore. One of them is that there's a focus on technological issues, and that has become more like a substitute for an actual political discussion. Because yes, the technical aspect of the nuclear program is important, and it is something that needs solving. But that's what it is. It's a technical aspect. In the long run, this is a political problem, and you need to have a political discussion about it. Policy cannot just be dictated by abilities to verify 2 kilos here, 5% there. That is looking at the trees and not at the forest. The second aspect of this, and this, if the first one goes both to Iran and the rest, so to speak, the second one has much more to do with our side, if you will, our side being the Western side, the EU, the E3+3, to be more correct, EU lingo, or the P5+1. Sanctions have now become a substitute for a strategic discussion. I think if you look at how the sanctions policy has been developed, it is now becoming a justification in itself, rather than as a tactical tool that's supposed to get you some strategic results. I think there's a lack of discussion about what the strategic goal is with all of this. Everyone is looking down, looking at the next step, perhaps the step after the next step, but no one seems to, and of course I'm not privy to any particular information, but from the outside at least I get the impression, and from talking to people, there isn't much discussion about where this is supposed to end up. And I think that's a discussion that is needed to be had before you go into negotiations with someone. Not just in order to clarify where you want to go yourself, but also because only through that discussion will you become aware of exactly how much you have to give to get what you want in the negotiations. And I think that is, if you will, one of the problems that I see in the present round of negotiations. There are different ways of interpreting this. But you could say, for instance, if you want to have an optimistic interpretation of what happened in Baghdad, is that, first of all, in Istanbul they met and they just talked, just to get a feel for each other. That's fine. Then the next meeting was a meeting where they actually started looking at the substance, and they became painfully aware of what the distance is between them in terms of what their red lines, their deadlines, etc. are. So in the third meeting then, hopefully, they're supposed to actually start tackling that distance between themselves and the other side. That's the optimistic reading. So Baghdad then becomes a waypoint, which is necessary. It's not fun, but it's necessary before you get to the actual headache, which is the negotiations. The more pessimistic reading, if you will, is that both sides have been so busy talking their own strengths up, pointing to the weaknesses of the other side, and therefore thinking that once they get to the negotiation, they can make the kind of demands that the other side simply has to give into. And when they don't, they are unpleasantly surprised. And from my point of view, the biggest problem with that is on the E3+3 side. If you will, it's a question of expectations. I had greater expectations on the E3+3 having a clearer idea of what this is about than necessarily the Iranians. We can discuss that. But for me, the problem, if you will, with the Baghdad meeting in a pessimistic reading is that people seem to have jumped one step ahead of themselves. Because coming to a negotiation is not the same thing as folding at the negotiations. And having now had a policy of sanctions for a number of years that people have been defending without necessarily being able to give any arguments for why it should be working, no one really knows because no one has really looked at it. There was a certain sense of triumph that finally the Iranians came to negotiate, which they did not necessarily only, at least, because of the sanctions, but also because they feel they have enough now that they are willing to give away to get what they want. And at that point, you're getting ahead of yourself if you think that just because you force them or manage to get them to come to negotiations, that means that they're basically going to fold and give in to all your expectations. They have not, and most likely they are not going to. Because there is a certain, if you will, structural stubbornness to how the Iranians see these things. Whether it's for ideological reasons or because of their own assessment of their strengths, which of course can be erroneous, but nonetheless, the idea that they will come and just give in, I think, is delusional. The other aspect, if you will, of this notion of sanctions as a substitute to a policy or a strategic thinking is that people think of sanctions as a kind of arithmetic, open-ended process. The more sanctions, the more pressure, the more concessions you can extract from the other side, which means that the more, the better. I don't think it works that way. I think the Iranians are not going to fold. They have their own set of goals that they want to achieve, and they think, I'm not sure they're right, but they think they can slug this through. They can muddle through all these economic sanctions, etc. And it seems at least they're willing to try. So in that sense, these negotiations are at a very crucial point, not just because you have to reach something at a given moment in a capital somewhere, but because you have to think about where this process is going to go. For each round of these sanctions, the results have to be more concrete. Because you are not conducting these negotiations in a vacuum. You're conducting them within a framework where war is a real policy alternative for some groups, camps, and countries. So they are not going to cut you the slack so you can just keep talking because it's better than coming to the conclusion that we can't reach a deal. So in that sense, for each round of sanctions, there has to be a concreter and concreter outcome for everyone to be able to go home and say, yes, there is good reason to continue the talks because we did actually manage to get something out of it this round, and next round we will do this, and after that we will do that. We are not there yet, but we need to get there very quickly. So on the one hand, everyone feels the urgency, I think, and everyone thinks that they have strong cards that they can hold on to, and it's the other side that loses if this drags out. Both sides think this. I mean, the Iranians are creating facts on the ground, to use Israeli policy speak. Basically, they're enriching while they're negotiating. So the longer these negotiations continue, the more they enrich. We, on the other hand, think that the longer we wait, the harder the sanctions will hit them. So therefore, when they come to negotiations, they will concede more. And at the same time, everyone says this is very, very urgent, because if they get to a certain point, they might be able to produce a bomb, and that is the cutoff point, so to speak, for negotiations. So everyone, in a sense, wants it to drag out in the sense that they think they can get more, and at the same time they think it has to be finished now. You can't square this circle. I mean, at some point you have to decide which one it is, but they can't be both at the same time. Somewhat similar to how people insist that the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians is still alive, even though what life after the peace process would look like, you can say to some degree everyone wants this negotiation to continue because it is politically necessary. But it has to yield some tangible results. And the idea that we can wait till November, for instance, which would be the American ideal point from after which a potentially re-elected Obama administration can then start actually thinking about what they are willing to give the Iranians, I think is unrealistic. Because that means you are going to have to keep this alive for the next 6 months without it actually getting anywhere, and yet at the same time be enough to keep the people who want a war at bay. Eating a cake, having it, selling it at the same time, difficult.